Okay, this week we're talking about Swamp Thing. my favorite superhero character and my favorite comic books to read more or less during the Halloween season. Specifically, I want to talk about the importance of the Alan Moore, Stephen Bisette, John Totleben, Rick Vetich run from the early to mid 80s. You know, I'm 42 years old, and it is very hard for me to go back and read the comic books I grew up with. I think a lot of them have not aged well, especially from the mainstream publishers. It's one of these things where like the memory is better than the actual reality, especially once you read like better literature and better writing. I mean, this is all stuff that's written for kids for the most part, but the exception to that, I think, is this specific run of Swamp Thing comics. When we talk about Swamp Thing, it's probably important to at least highlight a little bit of its horror connections beyond just what's on the page, but also what informed its creation. Now, we would have to reach back to the 1950s to do that. So I don't want to belabor it too much, but the point of origin is a fellow named Joe Orlando who he was an artist at EC, an assistant for Wally Wood, did a lot of science fiction comics. After EC collapsed and books like Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror and Weird Science and the like all just completely shuttered, Orlando eventually found his way over to DC after, skipping around to Warren and other publishers. He went to DC, became an editor, and edited his own sort of like line of books in a way, sort of like these weirder, fringier books. But specifically for our purposes, one of the books he edited was a book called House of Secrets. That was DC's equivalent of Tales from the Crypt, but more of a family-friendly version of it. And that is where he enlisted Len Wein, the co-creator of Wolverine, and Bernie Wrightson, the brilliant artist, to create this character Swamp Thing, who made his first appearance in House of Secrets. Now, the pitch behind Swamp Thing, when it eventually became its own solo series, because it just seemed like such a hot, cool property, they eventually gave it its own comic that Orlando also edited. The idea is that you took these Tales from the Crypt-like scenarios with monsters and supernatural beings, and you centered it with a star who's kind of like the Incredible Hulk. He's like wandering from scenario to scenario, to setup. And that's the book, and it's wrapped up in beautiful art, and it's a lot of fun to read, especially when you're on the younger side of things and you love monsters. The book didn't last that long, though. It was not a big sales hit. I think Wein and Wrightson both got off the book around issue 12 or so after about a year of publication. And then after a litany of other talents tried to come on and keep the book alive, it was eventually canceled. Fast forward to the 80s, and a Wes Craven movie about Swamp Thing was coming out in 1982. And so DC, in their attempt to jump on a trend, said, we're going to bring it back. And Len Wein, now editor of this new Swamp Thing title called The Saga of the Swamp Thing, launched. It was not a very good book for a while, and it had very bad sales as a response to that. And eventually, right around issue 17 or 18, they brought on a new artist named Stephen Bisette, who came from the Kubert School along with John Totleben. And these guys were pretty interesting because they had a real background in underground comics, sort of the stuff that, like, when you think underground comics, you probably think of things like Robert Crumb or the Fabulous Freak Brothers or whatever. And they brought like a new visual panache to Swamp Thing and a lot of that cool underground energy. And in what amounts to pretty much a Hail Mary for a book that he was very passionate about, but he knew was going to get canceled, Wein reached out to a young unknown writer named Alan Moore, who was doing very good work in the UK, specifically on a book that Wein was a big fan of called Marvel Man, which now is known as Miracle Man here in the US. But he reached out to Moore, brought Moore on to join Bisette and Totleben, and they began their run on Swamp Thing, and the rest is history. It's neat to see how creative teams kind of meld together their influences onto the page, where you have artists who have a very specific kind of background and influences, and you have writers who are coming from a very different direction, and to see how they sort of meld. It's a bit like chemistry, and I think that's one of the neat things about comics in terms of being a collaborative medium. But with the more Bisette Totleben team, you had, on the one hand, with your artists, Steve Bisette and John Totleben, they were very, indebted to like that late 60s, 70s counterculture underground comics movement, and there's a lot of kind of like extreme kind of visualizations. And of course, I shouldn't underscore the fact that also like Bisette and Totleben were very into monsters and very into like B movies and cool horror and stuff. And I think that really shows on the page too. But Moore brought this very sort of literary element too, and was kind of the first person to sort of bring sort of a mature attitude to mainstream comics. And I think those two things mixing together just made one of the great comics that I think anyone has the privilege to read, and they should. The pitch that they kind of pivoted Swamp Thing on is pretty easy to explain. Now, in Swamp Thing's initial origin, he's a scientist, his lab gets blown up, chemicals bathe all over him, and then he jumps into the swamp and he becomes a swamp monster. Pretty straightforward. What this team did, and I think this was like the more kind of led idea, was that what if he wasn't a man who became a plant, but he was a plant who thought he was a man? And this idea that the scientist just died, but the plants that surrounded him sort of imbued into his memories, they took on his memories, and they took on a form that was convinced they were the scientist Alec Holland before. This run by the Moore, Bisette, and Totleben creative team spans about 46 issues, though right around issue 36 is where Rick Vetich also joins and becomes part of the major creative nucleus. But it can be divided, I think, into three major movements. The first stretch of the book, it underscores the idea of Swamp Thing coming to understand his background better and sort of understanding who he is and what he is. And then this idea of solidifying his relationship with the on-again, off-again character, Abby Arcane, who is known as Abby Cable at this point. And they end up becoming sort of a romantic Beauty and the Beast kind of pairing. Within this stretch of issues, there's also this kind of Orpheus and Eurydice kind of tale that sees Swamp Thing going into hell to save Abby, who had been killed by his ongoing nemesis, Anton Arcane, also Abby's uncle. So this allows for like Swamp Thing to meet characters like the Demon and the Phantom Stranger and the like. Second stretch, which is the thing I'm going to focus on more, is what's known as the American Gothic arc, and that is the story that first introduces John Constantine, a character who in later years will eventually lap Swamp Thing in popularity and become one of DC's more iconic characters, I think. But it introduces him, and it also gives this creative team the opportunity to play with a lot of really cool horror tropes in this sort of like ongoing build to a greater crisis that is kind of building up in the background and leads to what I think is kind of the high point of the run overall. But we'll talk about that in a second. And then in the last stretch of the book actually sees Swamp Thing go to space. like all good horror things, eventually you go to space. But Swamp Thing loses his connection to Earth and the green and nature, and so he eventually goes from planet to planet. And a lot of really cool sort of visual takes on what Swamp Thing would be like out on New Genesis and out on one of these Green Lantern planets and cool desert planets and stuff. It's a really neat stretch of storytelling, and it gives Moore and company the opportunity to sort of play with different storytelling techniques. The other thing I really like about this run, there are also some really fun standalone stories. So, for example, when I was rereading one just last night, there's a standalone book about a guy named Chester. He's this hippie. He discovers this tuber on the ground, basically a sweet potato, that like grew off a Swamp Thing and just fell on the ground, and he just finds it. And he takes it back to his apartment, starts slicing it up, trying to explore it, trying to find out, is there any sort of cool chemical compound here I can use for something? And his friends all need something from him because he's also kind of a drug dealer. So he says, oh, let me give you this. This is all I got. And so he gives one to a friend whose wife is in hospice, and he gives one to this other guy who just wants to get high. And it's a comic about people tripping balls off Swamp Thing's tubers, which is just, the kind of thing you wouldn't have seen a few years before at DC. I think I should also sort of highlight too, before I go any further, because I'm going to forget, the other important person in this collaborative team is the editor Karen Berger, who jumped on after Ween stepped away from the editing duties. She kind of stepped in, I think, within about 3 to 4 issues of the run. And that's really when Swamp Thing, I think, took off as a more adult-leaning comic book, particularly in its sort of thumbing its nose at the comics code. And Berger begins up becoming a really important figure, especially later on. But this was sort of her launching pad, along with Moore's and Bisette's and Totlebin's. The rare run in comics that has a very, I think, specific ending. I mean, there's more afterwards, but the end of the book sees our heroes kind of walking off in the sun together, and it has like a nice happy ending. Eventually, Rick Veitch will come on and have his own run that I think really stands up to this Moore run, but we won't talk about that here. We'll talk about that later because there is some more Rick Veitch Swamp Thing coming next year. And I want to talk about that sort of collectively as its own entity, not tied to just this Alan Moore, Stephen Bisette, John Totleben run. So American Gothic, let's talk about that specifically, because I think that is of greatest interest for readers who are looking for stuff that has like kind of a Halloween horror context beyond just kind of the dark fantasy that's always sort of around Swamp Thing. But the story, in a broad sense, is about John Constantine approaching Swamp Thing. It's funny, actually, the background about Constantine, not to get too far into a side, but originally he was just kind of like a throwaway reference in a crowd. I think Bisette and Totleben were just like really big fans of Sting, the musician. And they're like, oh, we're going to draw Sting in the background. And Moore was like, oh, we should make that a character. And so that's how John Constantine was created. And in the very first issue, I think that was drawn by Rick Veitch. So they all kind of had a hand in the creation of Hellblazer. But anyway, he approaches Swamp Thing and says that I can teach you all about your past, and I can tell you about your abilities and kind of teach you what you are, kind of thing. I've got all these secrets I can tell you, but you've got to come with me and help me do some things. And in the background, there is this sort of cosmic horror, Cthulhu, Relaya kind of thing that's this Lovecraftian creature that is rising. And Constantine knows that this is the thing that has to be stopped. And he knows that the way that this thing is building up power is through all of these other little supernatural incidents that are occurring across the country. And because as people see these things, like they see vampires or they see werewolves or something, their belief kind of grows in the supernatural, and then they go and tell other people, and this whole thing starts to spread like sort of like a monomyth throughout the country that will give this great evil more power, and it's a pretty straightforward concept, but like in Moore and everyone's hands, I think it really is very arresting. And what I like best about it, beyond just like the overall mega arc that eventually sees Swamp Thing team up with all the DC magical superheroes like Phantom Stranger and Zatara and Zatanna and all these other guys, is that it allows the creative team to kind of bounce around to different sort of horror movie type setups. So for example, one of the very first things that happens is that they end up going to a town called Rosewood, Illinois, that is like completely flooded over. It's been turned into a big lake. And inside this lake are a lot of like vampires. What if vampires were underwater? Particularly, they lean towards kind of like piranhas. So it's kind of this interesting idea of like combining both vampires with sort of underwater predators, and that's pretty cool. Also, as somebody who doesn't live that far from the infamous Lake Lanier, the idea of a town that's been completely flooded, that people keep disappearing every time they swim in the lake, that's like a whole other urban legend that I think enriches this issue in retrospect. You see them take on things like werewolves, which that issue is of particular interest because to me, I think it might be the first reference of tying in both lycanthropy and a woman's menstrual cycle and a lot of the folkloric implications of that, as well as kind of the rage women feel at more abusive and bossy husbands and stuff. I think that might be the first time we see anything like that that eventually leads up to movies like Ginger Snaps and has become a little more commonplace. And then after that, you've got issues with zombies and ghosts on an antebellum plantation when these ghosts kind of take over this movie production that's trying to happen right there on the set. And then after that, you've got a really cool sort of spin on the Winchester house, and like it's on and on and on. These issues allow more Bisette and Totleben to play, and Veitch to play with these sort of horror tropes and kind of reinvent them from the ground up. And Swamp Thing is a major player in it, but he's also kind of like an observing passenger. He does participate and he helps solve a lot of the problems, but it's not as tied into his own core mythos the way the surrounding arcs are, which I think make it a really fascinating standalone read for anybody who not only wants to read some really cool horror books, but also get a chance to see where John Constantine originally comes from. And so if you want to check those issues out, specifically, those are issues 37 to 50 of Saga of the Swamp Thing. Not to say I think you should only read the American Gothic arc, which I think, while being a tremendous excavation of the dark heart of America and sort of the horrors of our past, I think that if you're going to read those, however many issues it is, 37 to 50, I think you should also just jump back to issue 20 and read up through 64, because it really is such a vital comic series and really a demarcation point between kind of comics past and then like sort of what our modern age of comics are. And anything you've ever enjoyed that's kind of mature in its leanings all has its roots in the Saga of the Swamp Thing. They're just a series that I think has so much importance, not only within the broader DC mythology and universe, but also in terms of the overall publishing strategy of that company and where it went for decades. I know a lot of people who have read the entirety of the Sandman over and over again without ever knowing that it was a Swamp Thing spinoff. And yes, indeed, it is. There are multiple characters who make their first appearance in Swamp Thing that eventually show up in Sandman as key players, but people don't even realize that. And also, there's a lot of like callbacks and structural things that happen in Sandman that have their start in Swamp Thing. Also, of course, Hellblazer is probably the other big Swamp Thing spinoff. But really anything that spins out of either of those two books, Lucifer, The Dreaming, anything, Dead Boy Detectives, Books of Magic, it's all on its face a spinoff of this run of Swamp Thing. And I think you really should sort of look into that if you're someone who enjoys those kinds of comics. Also, from a publishing perspective, Swamp Thing was sort of the first, I guess, missile fired off, the first salvo of what would eventually become Vertigo Comics. Swamp Thing was the first book to kind of turn its back on the comics code. And eventually that led to a number of other books doing the exact same thing, such as Green Arrow, The Longbow Hunters, and a number of other books that would come out around about that same time. They're considered pre-Vertigo books like The Question and the like. Eventually, Karen Berger, who was editing Swamp Thing, like I said before, she would start editing other books that were sort of reinventions of other superheroes, like Grant Morrison's run on Animal Man, or the Morrison Case take on Doom Patrol, or Peter Milligan and Chris Bacalo's Shade the Changing Man. These were all books that took like kind of these B-level, C-level heroes and turned them on their head in the same way that Moore, Bisette, and Totleben did with Swamp Thing number 21, The Anatomy Lesson. And so this eventually congealed into what we now know as Vertigo. All of these books ended up kind of getting shuffled off into their own corner, all edited by Karen Berger and a lot of her colleagues like Tom Pear and Stuart Moore. And that's what was the birth of Vertigo, these kinds of like reinventions of heroes, and then eventually create our own stories like Preacher and Why the Last Man and the like. But it all started with the Saga of the Swamp Thing. Anyway, that's my selling point and sales pitch for why you should read this book. I think you should check it out. You've got 2 weeks left in Halloween and the October season. Read it on and through the fall. There's a lot of cool like sort of change of season stuff in there too that I think really makes it an appropriate read even past the Halloween point. But certainly check it out. I think it's well worth your time, and it's one of the greatest comics ever made. And I owe those guys a tremendous debt of gratitude because it's very influential to me. Otherwise, like, comment, subscribe. As always, keep on reading, keep on watching. We'll talk soon. See you guys. Pow.
This video is sponsored by me. I have a book out. Do you like short horror stories in the vein of Stephen King? Small town interconnected intrigue a la Ray Bradbury? The narrative weirdness of Gene Wolfe? Then this may be the book for you. Pick up Taking Root by Kyle Pinion today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and any online book retailer.